Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be using pastels to draw this landscape with a lovely blue sky and some clouds. I'm going to be using soft pastels as well as pastel pencils for this. I'm mostly going to be using Kohinoor soft pastels and Kohinoor pastel pencils. I'm going to start with a light blue soft pastel. And I'm going to draw the line of the sky about 1/3 of the height of the paper. I'm drawing a rough jagged line to kind of follow the shape of the trees, of the canopies of the trees on the horizon. I also added a bit of white to that lower part of the sky because I want that part to be a little bit lighter. Now, as for the materials or as for the paper that I'm working on 1000 grit sandpaper. This is something that you can find in a hardware store, just a regular sandpaper. So this is not artist quality sanded paper, but it still works pretty well with pastels. It grips the pastel very well. It produces some vibrant colors, and the blending is pretty easy as well. You can also layer work from light to dark as well as from dark to light, adding multiple layers on top of one another. So that's a good thing when you're working with pastels. And like I said, this is a nice cheap alternative if you either can't find or can't afford artist quality sanded papers, which tend to be pretty expensive. I added a bit more white at the bottom. I want that part to be a little bit lighter, and I'm just blending this in a bit better. Now I'm going to add a bit more of this darker blue at the top to achieve a nice gradient. And this is going to blend pretty well. You just have to be patient and you have to keep pushing the pastel dust and blending it until you achieve a nice smooth transition, which you always can do with pastels. With some other type of pencils, some other types of media, it can be a little bit more difficult, but here it's usually pretty easy, especially on a surface like this one. Now you can see that I achieved a nice gradient starting from a slightly stronger, slightly darker blue color at the top and a slightly lighter color near the horizon. And now I'm going to start working on the clouds. Now I'm going to use a little trick here, and I'm going to show you what I plan to do. I'm going to use a kneaded eraser first to remove a little bit of the pastel, to remove a little bit of that blue color. Now why am I doing this? It'll become clear soon enough, because I'm doing it for two reasons. But first I'm just going to dab a little bit and remove a bit of that pastel, at the same time trying to make some suggestions of the shapes of clouds. Now there are two reasons why I'm doing this. First, as I'm lifting up the blue pastel, the dark grey or greyish surface underneath is starting to show because my paper is grey. And I'm going to use that color, that background color, for the shadow side or the dark side of the clouds. Now the other effect that this will do is that it'll allow the sandpaper to grip the white pastel that I plan to put on top a bit better and to achieve cleaner, whiter whites, so that I can have a nice range of value and greater contrasts. So I'm putting the white soft pastel on top, refining the shape of those clouds, and adding the lighter part, or the lighter sides of these clouds. Now I know that it doesn't look like much right now, but you'll see once I start blending it with a finger, we'll create some very realistic looking cloud effects. Now, as you can see, I'm dabbing with my finger, gently pushing that white pastel away from the lighter area onto this darker gray area. And you can see that I'm creating something that kind of looks like clouds, which are lighter on top and a bit darker on the lower side, which makes them look more three-dimensional. It kind of gives them more shape and volume, which is what you want to achieve with clouds, because clouds are three-dimensional objects. Now, another thing that you need to keep in mind is that since the light source is coming from above, the upper edge of those clouds should be a little bit better defined with a bit more contrast against the sky. And if you further want to refine some of the edges of those clouds and maybe refine their shape a little bit, you can also use a white pastel pencil or a white charcoal pencil. Something that's white and that can be sharpened and which can give you a bit more precision and a bit more control than just a soft pastel. But you can see what a nice range of value I have here, and this is something that you can really achieve with a minimal amount of effort. So it's a nice little trick to use when you're drawing clouds and when you're drawing a sky in pastels. And this is pretty easy to do with soft pastels, because soft pastels are they're very easy to work with. They're very quick to work with because they cover large areas very quickly and they blend very easily. And now I'm going to add some smaller clouds near the horizon, because as we're looking into the distance, these clouds at the top, which are closer to us, are larger, and then they're getting smaller and smaller as you look further into the distance. So I added some more clouds on the left, and then some smaller clouds below these larger clouds at the top. And I'm going to blend these in a similar manner. First I removed a bit of the blue pastel and revealed some of that darker grey, and then I added some white soft pastel on top, and then I blended these two and achieved a nice looking shapes of clouds which appear to have volume and show contrast between the lighter side and the shadow side. So like I said, this is a pretty quick and easy way of drawing clouds in pastels. And one of the things that I like to do when drawing landscapes, and when I draw in general, I just like to be able to create realistic drawings with as little effort as possible. That's one of the things that I like to achieve. That's one of the things that I like to do. And if you can do this when you're drawing landscapes, then the process of drawing will be far more relaxing and enjoyable for you. Now, I didn't really work out my composition. I just started working on the sky first. So now it's time to do a bit more planning on this composition. I'm going to have a line of trees, and I'm going to have some bushes, and I'm going to have a winding dirt road here in the middle. And after that, I'm just gonna block in the trees here on the horizon. So I'm using a green soft pastel here. I don't really know which one it is. I don't really know the exact name in the Kohinoor range. But if you're trying to do something like this, you can just try to pick a similar color, I guess. It doesn't really matter because it's going to be modified a little bit. So I just used this slightly darker green, and then I added an even darker green on top of that to achieve some darker tones. And notice how I drew the edge, already trying to imitate the shape of the tops of those trees, of the tops of those canopies. Now after I've done that, I'm going to add some black details, darker details on top of that. I'm going to add some textures and some shadows using black pencils. Now for this you can either use black pastel pencil, or you can even use charcoal pencil. I tried experimenting with both and they both work pretty well, but I think that the charcoal pencil may be producing just a bit more texture, which is what I wanted here, because I wanted to produce that texture that kind of looks like a bunch of foliage as seen from a distance. But the thing is that when you're working on sandpaper, unlike the regular paper, the blending tends to be a bit smoother for some reason, and you need to do a bit more work to produce that texture of foliage. Now here on some of this grass in the distance, I decided to add some yellowish tones. This color that I'm using now is kind of like an ochre color. So I decided to add some of those yellowish tones, and I'm going to mix those in with the green that I'm already using, because I want to have some variation in color, in the color of the grass. And now I'm continuing to work on this line of the trees on the horizon, and I'm using that same green pastel, and you can see how I'm trying to make some interesting looking shapes on the horizon. Now here in the foreground I'm going to have some bushes in front of those trees, and because there is a large area to cover here, once I've already planned things and laid down my sketch, I'm just going to block in these larger areas. But I can't block in all of it because pastels are a little bit messy to work with, so I still have to work from left to right and from top to bottom, so I'm going to try to avoid covering the lower right part of my drawing for now, because I don't want to make things too messy. Now what you can do is put a piece of glassine paper under your hand to minimize the smudging, but you have to keep in mind that as you're dragging the paper and the hand over some parts of your landscape, there will be a little bit of muddying. You will be moving a little bit of that pigment, so you might want to try to avoid that just by working in a certain order. And if you're right-handed like me, you're just going to try to work from left to right, which is what I normally do in most drawings anyway. But this is especially important when you're working with a messy medium such as pastels, because pastels, especially soft pastels, they have very little binder in them, and they just don't really stick to the surface of the paper as much as some other types of colors, some other types of pencils. So that's something to keep in mind. I'm going to use that black color to indicate some of the shapes here in the foreground. I'm going to have like a large thicket, some bushes, maybe some smaller trees, and I'm going to try to make that distinct, or I'm going to try to make that stand out against the background, against these trees in the background. And to achieve that, of course, I'm going to need to shade in such a way so that the lighter part of those bushes stand out, so that the viewer can understand that thicket is in front of those trees, in front of that row of trees at the back. Now for this dirt path, I use this lighter color. This is something like a cinnamon color, like a lighter flesh tone. And I'm going to combine this with some lighter brown tones to achieve something that kind of looks like a dirt path. And I think this color will stand out nicely against the grassy areas on the sides. I'm going to add some more details to it later. Right now I'm just trying to achieve the right color. So now I'm going to add a few more details to these bushes here in the foreground. Well, it's actually the midground, isn't it? I mean, the grass here at the bottom, that's the foreground. So I guess this is the midground. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding more texture and more detail here, breaking that green shape into slightly smaller shapes by adding some suggestions of shadows and textures and things like that. I think if you want to draw landscapes, pastels are really good for that, especially if you're using a combination of soft pastels and pastel pencils. They make this process a lot quicker than if you were working with colored pencils, for example, because the pastel dust can be moved around so easily. It covers larger areas much more easily, and it's much easier to blend. But of course the disadvantage of this is the messiness, because it smudges very easily and it's easy to spoil and ruin. Now here in the foreground I'm starting to work on the grass. I'm first going to use a darker pencil to make some indications of these clumps of grass, because what you want to do with the grass, you want to break it up into these smaller clumps. You can't draw every single blade of grass, so you just want to draw some indications of those blades of grass here and there, so that you can create an illusion of detail. And what you need to keep in mind when you're doing this is that the grass which is further away from you is going to be smaller and shorter, and the grass that is closer to your point of view, is going to be taller and larger. Of course, it doesn't have to be that way always, but that's usually the case, and that's usually a good way to achieve that feeling of depth. Now I'm going to muddy that a little bit and soften those textures a bit, and later I'm going to add some lighter details on top. So first I established some darker details to have something to work with, to have a darker background to work with, and then I'm going to use lighter green pastel pencils to add some lighter blades of grass on top. Now I'm just adding some more of those darker details to create a more realistic looking texture of the grass. This doesn't have to be perfect, obviously, and like I said, the further you look into the distance, the less defined the grass is going to appear, the less detail you will be able to see. So I'm going to start adding some lighter details. Right now I'm using this lighter kind of yellowish green color. It's kind of like a hay color, so I want to add some variation in the grass. I want to have some grass that looks a little bit more yellowish and a little bit drier. And I'm also going to add some white dots to have some flowers in that meadow as well. I'm using this lighter green to draw these lighter blades of grass, which will stand out nicely against these darker clumps, shadows between the clumps of grass, which I already drew, using a black pastel pencil. You can see how easily I can add these lighter blades of grass on top of the darker areas. The sandpaper is allowing me to add these lighter details without too much muddying. And the only problem here for me is that my pastel pencil isn't too sharp, but it's kind of difficult to get them to be really sharp because they tend to break. They are a lot softer than colored pencils, obviously. But you don't have to draw every single blade of grass. Like I said, a few indications, a few suggestions here and there will go a long way, and you'll be able to create some kind of an illusion of detail, something that looks realistic to the viewer without actually having to draw every single detail. And you just have to keep adding those, and like I said, you have to keep in mind that the grass in front of you that is closer to our point of view is going to appear larger and longer. And the reason why this works, the reason why this contrast works, is because if you're looking at grass, there will be some shadow areas which are kind of deeper in the grass and closer to the ground, and the blades of grass which are sticking out, those are going to be lighter. So that's basically what I did. I created a contrast between those lighter blades of grass and those darker ones which are in the shadow. I also added some flowers here using a white pastel pencil. I added some groups of flowers here and there, just to make the grass a bit more interesting. And also to kind of distract the viewer, because if it's only grass, then the viewer would pay too much attention to the amount of detail in the grass, and they would see how little effort I put into drawing a realistic looking grass. So here, if I just put a few flowers here and there, I can create a more realistic looking meadow with some details to distract the viewer. I'm just putting some lighter details on these bushes here in the midground to make them stand out against those trees at the back. And notice how I shaded the right side a bit more to make it a bit darker. I probably should have said this at the beginning while I was drawing the clouds, but you can probably see for yourself that the light source here is coming from above, but it's coming more from the left than the right, as you can see. So you will see that with my bushes and trees as well. The light source is mostly coming from the left and from above, and you can see a bit of shadow being cast by those bushes from left to right. So there's a bit of shadow on the right, and you need to stay consistent with the light source. And when you're drawing these landscapes, when you're drawing these outdoor scenes, the light source is usually going to be coming from above, from the sky, from the sun. I'm just adding a few more flowers here and there, just to make their distribution a little more even, and to make these green areas a bit more interesting and a bit more realistic. You should also try to make sure that the flowers in the foreground are a little bit larger. But if you can't always do that, it doesn't really matter, because I mean, the viewer can just imagine that they're looking at clusters of flowers, and you know, it doesn't really matter if you get it perfectly right. I'm going to add a bit of shadow here on the right side of this grass next to the path, because that's where the grass is casting a shadow onto this path, because the light is coming from the left, so the grass is going to be casting some shadow to the right. So maybe we can just imagine that some of these taller blades of grass are casting a bit of shadow onto that dirt road. And I'm just refining some of the details on this lower left part before I move on to the middle part and the trees which I need to finish here on the horizon. I'm going to have some more bushes here in the distance, And here I can't really draw blades of grass or clumps of grass at the in the distance, so I just have to make some suggestions of some variation in the terrain. So I'm using a tortillon to help me with that, and I also refine the shape of this winding path. Or is it a road? I guess I should call it a dirt road. And now I'm adding some yellowish tones to that grass to have some variation in color, not just in value, because that will make the terrain more interesting as well. And I'm also making these shadows a bit more realistic by adding some blades of grass in front of them. Just working a little bit more on this road. And now I'm going to add some details in the middle of the road. I'm just going to add a bit of grass growing in the middle of this dirt road, because the middle part of it, I guess, is not that well trodden. So a bit of grass is allowed to grow here in the middle. I'm just going to add a bit of green and a bit of black to add some indications of shadow under it. And I'm not sure how realistic this looks now, but I'm going to try to refine it. The idea is there's just a little bit of grass here growing in the middle. So I'm adding a few blades of grass to make the shape a bit more realistic. And now I'm going to move on to this larger area here on the right. I'm just working around the edge of this path, and I also want to have this part here in the foreground on the right. I want to have it a little bit higher, so I added some shadow above it to make it look like that part of the land there is raised a little bit. Now I'm adding some details to this dirt road, maybe some tracks and things like that. And I'm going to start working on these trees in the middle, trees in the foreground, in the background rather. I'm going to have a tall tree here, kind of sticking out on the horizon above the rest of the trees. I'm going to add a few more details to it, a bit more texture, and maybe some indications of branches and a tree trunk. But most of the branches in the tree trunk are kind of obscured by the foliage, by the canopy. So this doesn't have to be too complex. I just have to create a texture that looks realistic enough, and the texture that I'm trying to achieve is the texture of foliage as seen from a distance. So that will make for some realistic looking canopies. Sometimes pencils can just produce some random texture if you just drag them over the paper, but here, if you feel like the sandpaper is producing smooth blending and you're not getting enough texture, you may need to add a bit more variation in your pencil strokes, maybe add some dots, maybe add some shorter strokes and things like that, just to produce a more realistic looking texture. And another thing that you need to keep in mind is that the texture of the foliage will be different on the trees in the distance from the foliage on the trees and the bushes in the foreground, because the foliage on the trees and the bushes in the foreground is going to appear larger, so you're going to have to create a larger looking texture. and on the ones in the distance you want to create a finer texture, or maybe even less texture, because the objects in the distance will appear less detailed because of the atmospheric effect, and because they're further away. So what I have left to do is mostly the right side of this landscape, where I'm going to be adding some more trees and bushes on the right here, and I'm also going to have to decide what to do with the right side of the foreground. But right now I'm just doing the same thing that I did on the left. I'm creating that texture that resembles foliage. And I'm trying to break up that green area into smaller shapes of bushes, trees and stuff like that. I want these trees on the horizon to stand out in contrast against the horizon. And I also want some of this lighter yellowish color to make the grass more interesting. And I added a bit of that in the foreground as well, just to have a bit more of that color in the foreground. So now I'm going to do some more trees here, and you can see how the lower part of them is always a bit darker. That's because of the light source. And here and there I'm also adding a bit more shadow in between them, so that I can make some of these individual trees kind of pop out a little bit more, so that it just doesn't look just like a bunch of foliage. And I added a few lighter details using this lighter green pastel as well. Well, like I said, you have to make sure that your texture in the distance appears kind of smaller, that the grain or the grit of it is a little bit smaller and finer than the texture in the foreground. I can also use one of the lighter pencils to poke these holes in the canopies to make it look like the sky is visible from behind, that the light is coming through the canopies, because I don't want to make them completely opaque. I don't want to make them obscure the sky completely. So here in the foreground on the right, I'm going to have another large thicket, maybe a tree or a bush of some sort, doesn't really matter. And I'm going to add some indications of branches, and then work around them to add more foliage and more shadow, so that the lighter side of those branches and the trunk would stand out. I don't know how realistic it looks right now, but I'm sure that once all of the foliage and once all of the texture is done, it will appear more realistic. So I decided to do a slightly longer video for you. Now some of it is in time-lapse, as you can see, and some of it is in real time. But I wanted to do it a little bit slower than usual and do a slightly longer video, so that those of you who are interested in this technique could follow along. I'm not an expert in pastels by any means. I just like to draw landscapes, and I have done a few landscapes in pastels before. And I think that this surface, the sandpaper surface, is pretty good when working with pastels. So if you really want to work in pastels and you can't buy or can't afford or can't find higher quality sanded papers, just buy some sandpaper from your local hardware store. This is a waterproof sandpaper. They usually have very fine grits. You can even find a 2000 grit if you want, although I tend to prefer 800 to 1000 grit. It works pretty well with both colored pencils and pastel pencils and soft pastels, and you can try that. It grips the pastel pretty well. Now, as for fixing, because I know that some people are going to ask about that as well, I've talked about that in some of the other videos, but you can use a pastel fixative. There's no such thing as a perfect pastel fixative, and pastels are never really completely fixed. Some people choose not to fix them at all and just kind of try to find other ways to protect their drawings. If you're worried about color change, then maybe just don't fix them at all, or you can just use a light coat or a fixative. It's up to you, but that's just something you need to accept with pastels. They just can't be fixed very well, and you can always smudge them even when they're fixed. I mean, if you try to fix them completely, like if you try to use a ton of fixative, that would probably cover the whole drawing with a layer thick enough to fix that pastel dust into place. But I'm afraid that would alter the appearance of your drawing completely. It would look just like a completely different drawing. It would ruin many of the details that you spent hours working on. When I say hours, I don't necessarily mean hours. It depends on how much time you spend working on an individual piece. Here I think I needed about 2.5 hours for this one, so it's not a very complex scene. The part that took probably the most time was the foliage, because it just takes a little bit of time to produce that texture, and the grass as well. I think I did the upper part of the drawing very quickly. The sky, I just added a few layers of a few pastels, and then kind of blended them together to create a nice gradient, and then I did those clouds using that technique that I showed you. So here, as you can see, I created a small hill in the foreground on the right, and some trees in the bushes behind it. And now I'm just going to work on the grass on this piece of foreground on the right, using the same method. First I use a darker pencil, like a black pencil, to add those indications of individual clumps of grass, those shadow areas under those larger clumps of grass. Then I soften them a little bit with a brush or a tortillon. I kind of muddy everything a little bit, make everything a bit darker, because I want that darker background. I can use that to create some lighter details on top. I can use it for contrast with the lighter details. So I just add a bit more texture, adding some suggestions of grass here and there, and then I start working with a lighter pastel pencil on top of that, adding some of these lighter blades of grass which are sticking out and getting more light from above, getting more light from the light source. And that tends to do the job. That tends to make the grass look fairly realistic. There's just some details when I'm drawing landscapes as well as other drawings. There's just some details that I like to kind of simplify a little bit, and I guess that grass is one of those things. So forgive me if not all of those parts of my landscape look super realistic. I'm just gonna try to simplify some of these things and maybe add a few more details in the foreground just to draw the attention of the viewer. So what I like to do with my drawings, whether they are landscapes or some other scenes, is I like to have a combination of, how should I put this, slightly more detailed elements and more abstract, less detailed, more vague elements, where I can use the amount of detail and texture to draw attention to some of the parts of the drawing that I want to draw attention to. And here in the foreground I'm putting a little bit more of these flowers using a white pastel pencil, and just adding a bit more of those in the background as well, but mostly in the foreground where they will be larger and more visible. Adding a few of them by the road as well. So I think this adds a lot to the appearance of the whole scene. And I'm going to add a few of the blue ones as well, why not? I don't really know how much those will be visible. They are visible. Some of these details are only visible in real life. The camera doesn't really capture them that well, but it doesn't really matter. At this point I'm kind of just playing around with the scene, trying to make it more interesting. Now here I decided that this right side of the foreground was kind of empty, and I wanted to add one more thing to it, to add more depth and to make it more interesting. So I decided to add a large tree stump here in the foreground. And I started by drawing its outline with a brown pastel pencil. Then I did a bit of erasing so that I could put in this lighter pencil a little more easily with less muddying. And I used the same color that I used for the road. That'll be the light side of that tree stump. And then I'm going to add some more of those brownish tones for the darker side and for some of these textures for these cracks in the wood, in the tree bark. So already, as you can see, I shaded the dark side, and the tree stump is starting to take shape and look more three-dimensional, but we're not going to leave it like that. I'm going to add even more details using a black pencil. I'm going to add even more depth to it, a little more shadow in between these cracks, a little more shadow on the shadow side, and a bit more texture to make the object more realistic and more detailed, because it's in the foreground, so obviously it needs to be a bit more detailed than some of the stuff in the background. So I don't know what you think about my decision to add this tree stump, but I think that it made the scene a bit more interesting. Now I'm just adding some lighter details to this tree bark to make the texture of that tree, or that stump, a bit more interesting, and to make the light side a bit lighter to stay consistent with the light source. And just working around these, around the base of the stump and around these roots, to kind of integrate the stump into the scene a bit better, drawing some grass around it, and just modifying its shape a little bit. And I'm also drawing a bit of shadow around it, and adding a few more flowers as well. And I'm also going to add a bit more texture on top here as well. And then I'm going to add a bit of shadow here on the side, because this too is casting a bit of shadow onto the grass. So I'm going to make the shadow of irregular shape because it's casting a shadow onto these blades of grass. So some of these blades of grass which are in the shadow are going to be appear darker rather, and the ones that are in front are going to appear lighter. So just trying to make that object appear more three-dimensional, trying to make it look like a part of the scene. Now I'm just going to remove these bits of tape that were holding my my paper in place, and just working on these corners, covering them as well, so that they don't remain grey. Using that blue pastel that I used for the sky. This doesn't have to be perfect, I just have to smooth it out a little bit. I'm going to do the same thing with the other two corners that I haven't done yet. Just blending that a little bit with, and adding some finishing touches here and there. Like I said, it's up to you whether you want to spray the drawing with a fixative or not. I'm adding some lighter details to this foliage using this light green pastel, so that it would appear a little more three-dimensional. And these details are very hard to achieve if you're working, for example, with color pencils, unless of course you're working on sandpaper. I'm just going to do a little bit of refining on the grass as well. These are just some of the finishing touches. I hope you like the scene, and if you want to see full-length videos of my drawings and more content, you should check out my Patreon. You'll find dozens of full-length videos there, where you can observe the drawing process in real time and find much longer, more detailed explanations about both the drawing technique and the materials. Also, don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. There's my signature in the lower right corner. Don't forget to check out my other videos, and don't forget to give me a like and comment. I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a slightly longer one, and I hope you like this landscape. I'm going to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, and bye for now.